All right, so this video is just going to go over some settings for rendering in Arnold to get really high quality and good looking final renders when you're working in Maya here and rendering stuff out in Arnold. So we are going to get into sampling related settings and just discuss how to reduce noise in the final path traced image. We'll get into some more advanced settings as well. But first things first, we're going to start by talking about depth of field, actually, just how to quickly enable that and get that working in Arnold. Of course, we did discuss the topic of depth of field quite a few lectures ago, near to the beginning of the course. We discussed depth of field in theory based on how it works from an optical perspective, but let's see how we can actually get this effect in our 3D renders. So I'll start with just a quick scenario here. I'll just put a number of cubes beside each other. We'll just duplicate the object and just put a number of cubes in a row like this so that we can see the effect of the defocusing as distance increases, right? If we focus on, or if we create this simulation of focusing on the first cube here, we're going to want to see this defocusing effect as we look farther and farther into the scene. Of course, we can focus on any object we want, but let's start with that example. In order to turn on depth of field for Arnold, we are going to need to have our perspective camera selected. I'm just going to do a quick example here, just using the perspective camera. Of course, you could add any camera you like, but I'll just have that perspective camera selected there, and we'll have our attribute editor open and ready to go here. Let's launch an Arnold render. I will use the Arnold render view, and I'm going to dock it right up to the top of my 3D view here, just so that that window is not overlapping with the rest of the interface. I'll add in an Arnold area light just to illuminate the scene, and we'll be ready to go here and discuss how depth of field works for rendering with Arnold. All right, so we'll just make that a little bit wider there. Make sure that this area light is casting light on the whole row of cubes. And let's turn on depth of field and see what settings we have to play with here. All right, so again, with the perspective camera selected, we're going to need to do that through the outliner here. We're going to go look over in the attribute editor, and for the shape node for that camera object, we're going to scroll all the way down here to the Arnold tab and take a look at these depth of field settings. So first things first, we can enable depth of field and see that by default no effect takes place. We need to first set our focus distance, right? We need to know, at what point in the scene are the objects going to appear in perfect focus, and then so that we can define that either a shallow depth of field or a wide depth of field, depending on what effect we're trying to achieve here. All right, so the value that we're going to set on this focus distance attribute here, these are going to be in Maya units, so we're going to need to know how far away from the camera these various objects are. Now, a great way of doing that is, I'm just going to pause that render for a second so that my computer isn't dying in the background here. But a great way of figuring out how far away an object is from the camera is just to head over to Display, and under the Heads Up Display menu here, we can display our object details. So one of the, if we have an object selected here, one of the attributes listed for the selected object is going to be distance from camera. So that's really convenient. That'll help us figure out how far away from the camera a certain object is. So, right, so if we wanted to focus, let's say on this first object here, we could, and of course with our camera positioned, let's say right here, that cube would be 6.4 units away. Let's type that in, 6.4 units for our focus distance. Now again, there's still no effect here, and that's because we haven't specified any value for our aperture size. Now again, if we think back to the lecture where we discussed depth of field and focus from an optics perspective, we'll remember that this has everything to do with the size of aperture our camera is using, or our lens is using, right? And so we're going to need to actually specify a particular value for this attribute here. All right, so again, a value of 0 is going to have no effect. I've just turned the live render back on so we can see these changes taking place as we make them here. I shouldn't move the camera because that's going to throw off the focus distance. All right, but as we increase the aperture size here, we are going to start to see the depth of field effect being applied here. We're going to see areas of the scene, deeper in the scene being defocused, and of course areas closer to the camera than this exact focus distance that we have specified. Those areas as well are going to become defocused, right? Remember, the plane, that focal plane in the scene, described by this focus distance here, it's an infinitely thin plane where technically everything is in perfect focus, right? So that's what that setting means, and we can see the effect happening here in the live Arnold render. So let's do a couple different scenarios here. I'm actually going to move the camera closer here, and let's focus instead on, how about this cube in the middle here? That's going to be 8.1 units away. Let's change the focus distance so we can see that effect playing out in the final rendered image here. We can see we're focusing on that middle object. We can use, we can reduce the surface area of, or the size of the aperture, right? A smaller aperture, and remember, this is the actual size of the opening. Remember, your F number is going to be inversely proportional to the size of, or the diameter of the aperture, right? Small F numbers mean large opening, large aperture size, right? And of course, we remember from our lecture on the optics of focus and everything that smaller F numbers did give us shallower depth of field, right? Whereas smaller or larger F numbers, and therefore smaller aperture sizes, that gave us a wider depth of field, right? So there we go. Those are the primary settings you are going to use to achieve a depth of field effect in Arnold. And there's a few other settings here, such as aperture blades and curvature and rotation, where we can actually start to simulate the actual physical appearance or the physical construction of real aperture blades that you would find in a physical camera. Of course, by default, that these sorts of details don't exist in a virtual camera, so we could introduce those if we wanted to, and get those subtle effects. But we'll leave it at that for now. The focus distance and aperture size are the main attributes you're going to be interested in for dealing with depth of field. And with that out of the way, let's move on and talk a little bit about some ways of dealing with noise in an Arnold render. So to do that, I'm going to quickly change up the scenario here. I'm going to real quick just make a plane. We can head on over to, let's see here, we're missing our modeling tool, or our channel box. I'm just going to dock that over on the side here. There's our channel box. Let's take this plane, make that a little bit larger. I'm going to add a cube into the center here. Now for the plane, we're going to assign a new material here. We'll go with an AI standard surface, and I'm going to have this plane be fairly reflective. I'm going to drop the specular roughness down pretty low. We can check that value in just a second to make sure it works for this scenario. For the cube, I'll also assign a new material. Again, another AI standard surface. We're going to go with a fairly rough or matte finish here, and just leave things at that. Again, we're going to need another area light. I'll just quickly position this off to the side, and we'll have to adjust exposure and intensity in a second here. But let's I guess I lost my Arnold render there, so let's again dock that up on the top and just bring up the exposure. Let's turn on that live render there. Oh, we're going to want to turn off. We are going to want to turn off depth of field here. Forgot to do that. So we'll just turn off depth of field. We don't need that effect as we're just testing out these other Arnold settings. But I will set my exposure and then just do a fine tuning adjustment with intensity on that area light to get just a nice little test scene right here. All right, so nice, smooth, kind of glossy material on the ground plane. Nice, non-reflective, very rough surface on the cube itself, and we'll be able to use this to just experiment around with some different Arnold settings. Okay, so first things first, let's see where to find our render settings for Arnold. We're going to go to Windows Rendering Editors and your render settings, and inside of this window, we're going to find the common settings that we need to access for the overall Arnold render. All right, so over in the Arnold renderer tab here, we're going to find these settings. So we'll start in the sampling panel here and figure out what all of these different sampling values mean. So we'll start with camera AA. So first of all, what does the AA mean? AA stands for anti-aliasing in this context. And let's actually just quickly think back to the last lecture on path tracing and just recall some intuition here for why it makes sense to talk about anti-aliasing in this context. Remember that with path tracing, for each pixel, the scene is actually sampled from a different screen space position over the surface area of a single pixel, right? So if we're working with, by default here, we're working with 117 samples for each pixel. That would be, sampling the scene, getting, converging on a single color value for 117 samples per pixel in the final image. What we can see here, actually, we're going to start off with this. We're actually going to start by dropping, we're going to drop transmission, subsurface scattering, and volume samples to zeros. We don't have any of those material types present in the scene so far, so we're going to drop that down to 0. I'm also going to drop diffuse and specular to 1, pardon me. So we will talk about those in detail in just a second here, but I want to start by just making it clear what this camera AA attribute is doing for us. And so we'll start by having that set to a value of 1, right? So 1 on camera AA, 1 on diffuse and specular, respectively. All right, so again, back to this whole idea of, sampling a pixel multiple times at slightly different positions across the pixel's surface area. In addition to, it eventually providing, the opportunity to calculate global illumination for specular and diffuse bounces and everything. Sampling a pixel multiple times from slightly different positions kind of gives us anti-aliasing for free. So with a single camera AA sample, look at some of these lines on this cube. Right here, actually, we can see an aliased, jagged, pixelated line. Hopefully that's clear on the video recording, right? So in addition to the ridiculous amount of noise in this image, let's just make the first thing clear here that by only using a single camera sample, we are effectively not anti-aliasing the image. And of course, as we know, anti-aliasing is one thing that path tracing sort of accomplishes for free when we sample a pixel multiple times here. All right, so let's, again, with diffuse and specular set to 1 sample each, let's bring camera AA even up to a value of 2 here. We'll discuss what these numbers mean in just a second, but we can see that even raising that camera AA value slightly, we have already anti-aliased this final image and are getting some nicer looking results here. All right, so that's the first thing out of the way. That's what the anti-aliasing means in this context. Might be a little bit confusing if we're not used to thinking about path tracing as a process which accomplishes anti-aliasing for free. Okay, so first things first, the value that we type into the camera AA attribute here, it's actually squared, right? So if I set camera AA to 2, our camera AA samples are actually going to be 4. So we do just have to keep in mind that this value is squared, and keep that in mind when we're setting, maybe a test render setting somewhere down, maybe 2 or 3, something like that. And our high quality render, upwards of maybe like 5, maybe 6 or 7 camera AA samples. We do have to keep in mind that this value actually will be squared. So now with diffuse and specular, we take those values that are entered in here, again, square it. So 2 squared is 4, and multiply that with the camera AA samples, right? So this 2 here will mean 4 diffuse samples times the 4 camera AA samples that we already have set, giving us a result of 16 diffuse samples. All right, so that's how diffuse and specular are calculated, right? We can do the same thing with specular samples here. So maybe we'll keep that at 1. And then we can see, of course, for total samples here per pixel, that we basically just add everything up, right? So 4 camera AA samples, 16 diffuse, another 4 specular samples, giving us a total of 24 samples being calculated, or 24 rays being traced per pixel here. All right, so let's take a look at the difference between diffuse samples and specular samples. It is kind of interesting to see that noise can be introduced into the render in only one of these categories. And it's really interesting to see the difference here. So what I'm going to do to start with a very simple scenario is to drop everything down to 1, and we're going to only increase a single value here. So we'll get zoomed in nice and close to this test scenario. And let's examine what happens when we bring up our diffuse samples. So remember our diffuse samples, this will be calculating the indirect diffuse illumination, calculating how diffuse light scatters around the scene. So quite specifically, we're going to be looking at areas like behind the cube, right? This lighting in here is going to be mostly diffuse lighting. Same in this area as well, a little bit on the front, on this front area of the plane, but we are not going to see this effect. We're not going to see this this diffuse setting impact the effect of this specular reflection here, right? Because this on this very smooth reflective surface, where we can see the area light being reflected here, this is being caused by specular reflection, an entirely different type of ray. So let's increase diffuse samples here, right? So up to a value of 2, up to a value of 3, 4, right? So gradually actually it's quite dim behind here. There's only a tiny bit of indirect diffuse lighting being bounced onto the backside of this cube. We can see the effect a little bit better on the side of the cube here. We're going to keep increasing those diffuse samples, and we can see this gradually getting cleaned up. And just to push this quite far, I'm going to bring diffuse samples up to 10. We're actually doing 100 diffuse samples, right? So 10 squared, 100 diffuse samples per pixel here, and we can see that this has actually cleaned up the indirect diffuse lighting, the global diffuse lighting, quite a bit, while leaving the specular bounces at just 1 sample per pixel. Still so much noise in terms of specular reflections here, which is still very apparent on the surface of this smooth plane. All right, so that's kind of interesting to just see how that is how diffuse noise is independent of specular noise. And of course, we can do the exact same thing here by just slowly bringing up the number of specular samples we have. So increasing those, up to 6 now. Again, it is only shading that is calculated as a result of specular reflections that gets cleaned up here. So once we wait for this render to complete here, the indirect diffuse lighting is still a mess, at 1 diffuse sample, but specular reflections look great. All right, so that's interesting to know. And when you're trying to clean up your render, what you're going to want to do is carefully examine the scene and figure out, well, is it where's the majority of my noise coming from? Is it from the diffuse indirect lighting? Is it from specular reflections? And you can actually target the type of noise you need to clean up, right? So the awareness of what these attributes actually affect, and of course an awareness of how path tracing actually works behind the scenes, is going to turn out to be very useful here when we're trying to clean up our renders. All right, so we can drop those back down again. And of course, hopefully it's clear here, if we have considerably more noise in one of the 2 categories, let's say in this example, I need quite a bit more, maybe I need quite a few more samples for specular reflections than diffuse reflections, then I can set these 2 values independently and then raise the camera AA attribute here to basically make use of the squared values of these diffuse and specular samples as a multiplier, like a global multiplier for every sampling value in the render. All right, so that's how those work. Let's bring these back to just ones, and let's quickly look at a transmissive object. So I'll just change the scenario slightly here, bring in a sphere. We'll scale that down a little bit and move that in front of the cube. I'll add another AI standard surface here, and this time we're going to use transmission. So I'll bring my transmission weight up to a value of 1 to make this object fully transparent, or make the material fully transparent and allow light to refract through it. And well, we're going to see that the object is actually black, right? So I can bring that transmission weight back to 0. We can see now it is opaque. But if I bring it to 1, well, why isn't it transparent? Well, let's just recall here for a second that we did turn transmission samples down to 0. So there's actually no refraction rays being calculated in this render here. So once we bring transmission rays up to at least a value of 1, then we can start to see the some transmission take place here, and the same deal goes. We can specifically target the quality of our transmissive materials by bringing up the transmission sampling value. We're going to see that that value being again like multiplied kind of globally as a result of raising the camera AA samples. And so we can, again, use this awareness of the fact that refracted rays are actually a separate category of rays being introduced into the shading calculation here in the path tracing algorithm, and we can specifically target this type of ray in an effort to clean up the noise in a final render. All right, so that is that. We'll come back to transmission in a few moments when we deal with some other settings here. But for the time being, I am going to get rid of that object because there's some other settings we should talk about. All right, now there's also subsurface scattering and volume rays here. Again, we're not going to get into these. We briefly talked about subsurface scattering previously when we were talking about BSDFs. And again, it's that type of material is specifically used for, something like skin or some material that allows light to enter the surface and scatter around inside. But again, we're going to see the same behavior play out if you were to look at those sorts of examples. All right, we don't need to go through those. Okay, so next let's move on to adaptive sampling, which is an interesting tool which allows the rendering engine to take a look at the variance in color values being found for different pixel samples. And if we have a high variance for a certain pixel, then we basically apply more samples to those pixels, right? Let's just examine, our really, really terrible looking image here with camera AA, diffuse, and specular all set to 1 sample. And we can see here that, well, it's quite clear that some areas of the image simply have more noise than other areas, or more, the region itself resulting in greater variance between values calculated per sample. And of course, it's pretty clear that when we only have one camera sample per pixel, we get one value per pixel. So we can kind of see this variation, or the variance in pixel samples quite clearly, just comparing adjacent pixels to each other. So the idea with adaptive sampling, if we were to turn this on, is that up to a maximum of a certain number of pixels here, that's actually, or up to a maximum of a certain number of samples here. I'm going to drop that to 10 actually, otherwise my computer will be dying in the background here. You can probably hear my fan just making a lot of noise in the background. So I will reduce the maximum camera AA samples to 10 just to allow this render to complete in a reasonable amount of time and with a reasonable amount of effort. Yeah, up to a maximum of 10 camera AA samples. And again, considering the kind of multiplier effect that this has on both diffuse and specular samples, we're able to take the noisier parts of the images and apply more samples to those pixels and not have to do that for every other pixel, right? I mean, we saw, if we turn this back off, we saw that there's almost no difference for this top portion of this cube. It's already pretty clean, not a lot of noise there. Of course, with this illumination being calculated fairly directly, this surface is not receiving really any indirect lighting. So it doesn't make sense to spend a lot of computational resources calculating, what did we say? 10 camera samples for each of these pixels, right? And so let's just pause that for a second so we can mess around with these values without starting and stopping the live render. Of course, we can see here that by actually setting camera AA to a value of 10, of course, we get 100 camera AA samples and 100 diffuse samples, 100 specular samples, of course, multiplying through by 1 squared for diffuse and specular. So we can see basically the maximum number of samples or the total number of samples we would be computing for every pixel in the scene if camera AA was in fact set to 10. But you know, we can keep that down at 1 just for example, and enable adaptive sampling, set the max camera AA samples to 10, and we can see that we actually have a range now, right? So this range, right, from, for example, 1 to 100, this should make sense now in light of what we just discussed, right? So we can use anywhere from 1 to 100 samples to get the noise worked out of this image, right? So that's what adaptive sampling does for us. And that is a way of more efficiently working through the scene and only applying the samples where we need them. And this adaptive threshold is just, how noisy a pixel has to be in order for for a greater number of pixels to be applied to that, or a greater number of samples to be applied to that. I keep misspeaking and saying that wrong. All right, so let's turn that off. Let's move on to another setting here. Finally, we'll talk about ray depth, which is another panel we can expand down here. Quite important, depending on what you're doing with your render. And ray depth has to do with the number of bounces for each type of ray in the scene, right? So again, in a previous lecture, we discussed how in path tracing, rays are bounced and shading values for these surface points in the scene are calculated recursively. So this ray depth is just telling us how many times are we allowed to bounce each type of ray in the scene. So the total is, going to be the total number of bounces ultimately involved here. But the values we are most interested in are for, diffuse, specular, and then transmission if we are dealing with transparent objects. So to really show how diffuse ray depth works here, I'm going to slightly change the scenario. I'm going to extrude this up into a volume, an actual three-dimensional object. Let's place some multi-cuts here. I'm going to make a little window in this box. We're just going to make a little window here and allow the light to shine through that window. We're also going to go to Mesh Display and reverse the normals so that this makes sense. So that the inside of the box is the front side of the faces. And we'll just position that area light out like that. I'll dolly in here. So we're on the inside of the box. I'm also going to drop my focal length down. Let's go 18 millimeters to just offer a wider field of view so we can see the interior of this box that we've created. I'm also going to go for a rougher material on this on the box itself, just so we can get more of a sense of the diffuse, the indirect diffuse lighting on the inside here. All right, and let's take a look at this diffuse ray depth and see what it's all about. So if we were to drop this to a value of 0, it's actually pretty interesting to see that the only effect we're able to achieve here, the only shading effect in terms of diffuse lighting, will be the equivalent of direct illumination. Okay, so it's, we're calculating illumination with a single bounce of light. We can clean up that single bounce of light. We do have to use camera AA samples for this because there's no secondary bounces of light, so we can clean that up a little bit just to get a better sense of what this direct illumination looks like. So yeah, this is basically what we get if there is no extra bounces of diffuse lighting. We achieve no indirect illumination. We can clearly see that in the corners here on the front side of this box. We can see that there is no indirect diffuse illumination. Now, if we bring this up to a value of 1, even with a single indirect diffuse bounce, we start getting the effect of indirect lighting and therefore global illumination on the inside of this environment here. We can even push this further and allow for a secondary bounce of light. We can see that overall the scene does get a little bit brighter. That tends to be the effect when you allow additional bounces of diffuse lighting. But I mean, it's not as though we're adding any extra light energy into the scene. So the effect is going to taper off after a number of extra diffuse bounces here. And, things will start to get a little bit more uniform. We'll start to see the light being spread out and having more of a global effect on the interior here. But yeah, that makes for a good example to show what the diffuse ray depth actually means. All right, so that is something to keep in mind, especially, we're going to see this especially important when rendering interiors. You're going to want to work with, anywhere between, see what happens with one diffuse bounce, see if that's sufficient to light the interior, if that's what you're trying to render, but you may very well need more diffuse bounces to make the interior make sense and to make it appear to be lit naturally. Okay, so that is diffuse bounces. Let's again just reset to a value of 1 on camera diffuse and specular here. Once again, I'm very quickly going to change the scenario before we talk about specular ray depth. Go back to just a a flat surface here. We're going to make the cube, we'll make it metallic and drop the specular roughness down quite low. So this is a very reflective material. Make it slightly glossy just to have a nice effect there. And I'm going to go ahead and add in, how about a couple spheres? And I'm going to position those right in front of the cube, just so we have something to reflect here. Maybe I'll make a few of those. All right, so we'll do something like this, just quickly to have something to reflect off of the cube. And there we go. Maybe I'll move those over slightly so that we can see the cube a little bit better. Okay. So this makes sense. You know, if we only need a single specular ray bounce, right? You know, that one ray bounce being responsible for you know, bouncing off of this reflective object and hitting some other object, such as this non-reflective sphere over here. That will work quite well. Let's actually clean up our specular reflections a little bit, just to be able to see that a little bit more clearly here. All right, so one specular bounce works just fine for this scenario. However, what if we took these spheres here, and I'm actually going to go ahead, I should have named this material. That's AI Standard Surface 3. What if we go ahead and assign that reflective material to these spheres as well? Well, look at the effect that we have in the reflected image of these spheres. Notice how the spheres are completely black. Why is that, right? You'd expect, since, I mean, we can see right here, we can see that the spheres are reflective. So we should expect to see the reflections on the spheres in the reflection on the cube, right? Why are we not seeing those reflections? Well, it has to do with how many specular bounces we are permitting in the final render. We're only permitting a single specular bounce. So, you know, like I just finished explaining a few moments ago, right? We're only able to get the surface of these spheres visible in the reflective cube here, and well, we don't have any additional information about the appearance of those spheres, so they're gonna appear dark, perfectly black, right? But if we introduce a second specular ray bounce here, we will be able to start getting those reflections in, right? This requires two specular bounces, one off the cube, another off the sphere to get the mirror images reflected off these spheres as well, so that those can show up in the final render. Okay, so that is what happens with specular ray depth, and why, again, remember, specular ray depth is always set to 1 by default. So if you need to reflect reflective objects, you're going to need to take a look at that setting and make sure it is set accordingly. And, you know, so on and so forth. If you have additional reflective objects you need to deal with in the scene. Now let's just quickly move on to transmission here. I'll start with a value of 0 actually. And again, change the scenario slightly. Let's use just one of these cubes. One of these spheres. And let's just move it right around here. We can turn off the render for the time being. And I'm going to assign actually a new material to this. Again, let's make that transmissive so that we can, so that it is transparent. And well, of course, by default, because we have all our transmission rays turned off, we need to make a few adjustments here. So first and foremost, we do need to have at least one transmission sample being calculated per pixel. And furthermore, we need to have a ray depth specified for transmission here, right? And it turns out the default value here needs to be 2, right? That is the minimum number of transmissive bounces necessary to refract light through a 3-dimensional object in one side and out the other. Okay, so that is what the transmission ray depth is all about. Without having that at a default value of 2, we are going to be unable to see through objects, and it's simply because we have not permitted rays to actually bounce out of the object and collect information from somewhere else in the scene. Okay, so that's your transmission ray depth, and now you know what those settings are all about and how to go ahead and just tweak the settings in for your Arnold render depending on the scenario that you're working with. All right, now the last thing we're going to deal with here is just the whole business regarding these shadows. So again, we'll revert back to just ones on everything. We can drop transmission back down to 0. Again, it doesn't really matter, but there's no transmissive objects in the scene anymore, so we don't need to worry about calculating those samples. And I'm also going to bring this cube back as a dielectric and make it fairly matte, just to get an easy scenario, an easy material to work with here. Okay, so we looked at how diffuse samples cleans up the diffuse indirect lighting. We looked at how specular samples clean up the specular reflections. But you probably noticed back when we were talking about those two settings, you probably noticed the fact that the shadow did not change, right? The shadow that this cube is casting was not affected by either of those settings. So why is that? Well, again, as with even traditional recursive ray tracing, we still are casting shadow rays. Like we are, one of those rays involved in calculating diffuse lighting needs to know whether or not the surface point is obstructed by some other object. Now, there's plenty of differences between path tracing and traditional ray tracing. One of those differences being that we actually achieve soft shadows again for free, just because we are more accurately simulating the way light bounces around a scene in general. But the noise that we're seeing here, being caused by these, for lack of a better term, let's call them shadow rays that are being cast, actually has to do with another sampling value. And that sampling value is actually a part of the light settings. So I am going to select that area light. Let's actually bring it down here so it is a bit closer. We can see that selected. But I am going to go ahead and select the area light itself and take a look at its settings over in the attribute editor. So looking under the shape node, we are gonna find a samples attribute. All right, so this sampling value has to do with cleaning up the noisy shadows in your image. So again, we want to be aware of the different aspects of path tracing and what sampling value affects each part. So, to target specifically the shadows, and therefore, if the shadows themselves are specifically noisy, instead of cranking up your camera AA and, calculating oodles and oodles of extra samples for diffuse and specular bounces that we don't need to calculate. We can instead leave that as it is and just start increasing the number of, think of these as shadow samples. So even with a value of 2, we're already starting to clean up those shadows, 3, 4 shadow samples here, and those soft shadows are being cleaned up very, very nicely. All right, so that is how you can deal with noisy shadows. All right, so that's just a quick overview of some common Arnold settings that we're going to want to be aware of for cleaning up noise in your renders. Again, with a little bit of depth of field mixed in there at the beginning. So hopefully that was useful. And good luck in creating nice, high quality Arnold renders.